The disclosure problem is one of the chief barriers facing people who are trying to sell an idea in an ideas market. It was first stated by this man, Ken Arrow, who won a Nobel Prize for economics and is regarded as one of the world's most famous and influential economists of the last half of the 20th century. And the way he stated this problem is thus. Suppose you are a buyer. How do you know what the idea or information is? So if you're in the position of a buyer, someone approaches you and says, I have a great idea, I have a great set of knowledge that I would like you to purchase. How do you know what it is? Okay, they can make all sorts of claims, but what are those claims and how can you verify them? Now the seller, of course, to overcome that problem, could just tell you what the idea is. Okay, but there is an issue that arises in that instance, and the issue is that the buyer, if you're sort of shrewd or self-interested, may well come back and say, well, I already knew that, whether they knew it or not, or this isn't very new, or I don't think this is worth very much. And the problem is that you don't know if that's really the case as a seller, or alternatively, if the idea is very valuable and you've effectively just given it away. So if you're a seller who is concerned about this sort of opportunistic behavior or expropriation, what you would do is you either keep the idea to yourself, pushing you towards the compete option and cutting off the option of dealing in the ideas market, or alternatively you can go into the ideas market, but you have to expect you're not going to get a great amount for the idea. You'll keep the idea to yourself, you'll show a bit of what, say, a computer program can do, but you won't show about the quality of the code inside because you don't want to give away the secrets. And as a result, because buyers have a natural reason to be skeptical, you're going to end up selling that idea for a discount. This is a fundamental paradox that lies at the heart of disclosure and selling ideas, and it's not easy to get around. Is it something that occurs in reality? This is a familiar dial for anybody who has a car. It's the dial that controls your windshield wiper. The windshield wiper obviously has a number of settings, fast and slow, but perhaps its most useful setting is the intermittent aspect, where you can control the rate at which the windshield wiper wipes. And as it turns out, that was quite a difficult problem to solve. Car manufacturers up until the 1960s could only have windshield wipers go slow or fast, where they went slow or fast. A guy named Bob Kearns, who was an engineering professor in Michigan, realized this was a problem and realized that what you want is you want a windshield wiper to work more like a blinking eye. That is, you want it to come up, swipe, and then pause. Swipe, and then pause. The rate of the swipe is the same, but the pause is the thing that is controlled by the intermittency. Now, Bob Kearns was, an individual engineer. There's no circumstances under which he would take this idea, as good as it is, and simply build out his own car company to commercialize it. So instead, what he did is he fitted out his Ford car with his new invention and drove it down to the Ford plant to show them. Upon doing that, they got to see that he looks like he had cracked this a very important problem. And as a result, they were interested in purchasing it and came to some sort of arrangement. Unfortunately, so a part of the side story here is that Kearns actually had been granted a patent on this idea, and had come to eventually hold that patent himself. Ford was notoriously anti-patents, and in fact decided to effectively pass on Kearns's invention. To Kearns's dismay, some years after, in fact 7 years after he initially drove his car down to that Ford plant, he was at a car show and saw essentially his mechanism in the new Ford releases for that season. What ensued was years and years of litigation on this issue, as summarized by this infographic. Now, Kearns eventually won. Took him 20 years, won many millions of dollars, but it's kind of a sad story because he lost his life and he never invented anything else again in pursuit of Ford and then many other car companies for his invention. Had he done something some other way, perhaps he could have avoided the consequences of the disclosure problem. That said, patents and IP can protect against such expropriation. One of the purposes for formal intellectual property protection, such as patents, is that they allow the patent holder to block others from commercializing an idea. In principle, what that means is that if you drive your invention down to the Ford plant and it is covered by a patent, they can't produce it. Now, when Kearns started, the patent system was not as strong, but the various reforms in 1984 and beyond made it much easier for smaller inventors, such as Kearns, to defend and then take on larger companies who might be exploiting their intellectual property rights. And alongside that, there are a lot of issues associated with that, and that's something that you might reflect on. However, one of the chief benefits of the patent system is that it does encourage disclosure of inventions. It gets them out there. And at the same time, it can kind of lubricate the market for ideas because it reduces the risk of expropriation. And we see this in the data. Increased patent rights have actually been associated with, well, as you can see here, an explosion in licensing of patents. Licensing of patents is where inventors and patent holders license it to other firms. So it's one of our indications of activity in the market for ideas. Almost a decade and a half ago, myself and a couple of co-authors conducted a survey of startup firms to look at their commercialization choices to see when they chose to compete versus cooperate. As you can see here from our survey results, that there were two main drivers of cooperation. The first is whether the incumbent had something of value that could be matched with the idea and enhance it. If that was the case, that almost doubled your chance of cooperating rather than competing, at least in this survey. This was several hundred firms, by the way. You could also have a situation where we asked, can the invention by the startup preclude effective development by the incumbent? Now, there are a few ways in which that can occur, but the predominant means that we identified was, of course, patents. Because if you secure a patent, then the incumbent can't pursue the same idea anymore, at least not without your permission. And that led to also a very big bump in whether there was cooperation rather than competition among startup firms. Finally, in a later analysis that we did, we looked at some timing issues associated with licensing and intellectual property protection. What the graph in front of you shows is the probability that licensing occurs in the weeks and months up to the grant of a patent, right there at 0 on the x-axis, and some months afterwards. And you'll notice that there is a big jump in the probability of patenting just as a patent is granted. Now, why is that? Well, think about the process of patenting. You apply for a patent, and then you go through a series of revisions and other things with the patent office, and you eventually come out with the agreed upon patent at the end of it. So there's some uncertainty over that process. It's not the only uncertainty associated with patents. There is uncertainty also when you have, try to defend it later on. Just because you've got a granted patent doesn't mean that it will be held up in a subsequent legal action. However, their analysis here showed something interesting. Why was it that the grant of the patent was so significant? Well, there are a few reasons this could be important. One is it's really just pure uncertainty. One is that basically when the patent was granted, effectively that gives the startup or inventor a bit more bargaining power. And if they have a bit more bargaining power, they're going to be happier about transferring some of that tacit knowledge and other things that aren't quite in the patent along with their idea. So it can become in the interests of both the established firm, the licensee, and the startup firm, the licensor, to wait until you know exactly what the patent is before you cut to a licensing agreement. And that's what seemed to happen here, suggesting something about the disclosure problem was operating in the micro level of the markets for ideas. Another indication of all this, another solution, if you will, is based on reputation. This is Throop Wilder. He's a Boston-based serial entrepreneur, and he was founded one of the first ventures involved in exploiting the potential of the commercial internet. That is, hooking up small and medium enterprises to the internet. Basically came up with a turnkey operation, an internet in the box, and founded the American Internet Corporation to develop this general purposing IP addressing within networks that effectively allows all the many small businesses to hook up their own networks to the internet. For Wilder, he didn't build that out all the way. He founded the firm in 1995, and then he was acquired by Cisco, the great network infrastructure provider, in 1998. And one of the sayings comes from thinking about entrepreneurs who sell their firms to places like Cisco. There's being bought, and there's being bought by Cisco. Why? Because Cisco has developed a reputation for not engaging in the opportunistic or expropriative behavior that we were worried about when we talked about the disclosure problem. As another example, this is Tom Gillis. He founded a company called Ironport in 2000, and it was acquired in 2007, again by Cisco. And he wrote a book on that basis. Some other companies today are getting that reputation. For instance, Google. Google have been an assiduous acquirer of startup firms. Here's just some data before the recent flurry. They were buying many for billions of dollars, all the way up to Motorola for $12 billion. And they bought them from all over the world. And moreover, those acquisitions are increasing year by year. Now, Google have again developed a good reputation for this sort of startup acquisition, and in fact, a whole process behind it. Interestingly, Google don't like to acquire startups who are looking to be acquired. They want to find startups that feel that they've got a very good business and have credibly committed to it. So there's an interesting dance of signaling that occurs in these markets. If you want to find out more, you might go to we'vebeenacquired.tumblr.com that has some of the list of letters the founders have written upon being acquired in recent times. Just one follow-up. A story of expropriation occurred in relation to America's Funniest Home Videos. The person who came up with the idea, or came to, is Greg Kinnear, famous Hollywood actor, and he accused ABC of taking that idea and actually won a case against ABC. Now, who is Greg Kinnear? Well, there he is there. But interestingly, he played Bob Kearns later on in Flash of Genius, a movie about the Bob Kearns story with the intermittent windshield wiper. So, as you can see, there is a funny sort of link between those two. In fact, Bob Kearns' son, when I noted this connection, always wrote to me and said that he thought that Greg Kinnear was always extra committed to this role. Maybe he was. How do we resolve the disclosure problem? Well, there are a few other ways other than the ones I've already mentioned. One is we could use secrecy. We could also use competition. You could hold something back. You could use intellectual property protection, which we've already talked about. You can use a buyer's reputation, also there. But let's talk about those initial three. What about secrecy? Well, secrecy has costs. Let me give you a story. Forceps delivery. You may not know much about forceps delivery, but forceps delivery was a way of delivering babies that are having a little bit of trouble coming out. It was invented by the Chamberlain family in France in the mid-1500s, and they emigrated to England. But interestingly, with this method, they kept the method secret for a century. Okay, these are the forceps they initially invented and used. It's a pretty simple instrument. You'd think it would be hard to keep it as a secret. However, they did so because there was a real art to it. And what they did was they prevented other people from exploiting that art or even seeing what's going on. Now, what's the cost of that? Well, the cost of that is there were only a few people who could do this forceps delivery. And so it was a procedure for the rich or the monarchs and other things in Europe. And so in that respect, it was denied throughout the entire population and denied to them in terms of lives that could be actually saved. That's a cost of secrecy. Now, the Chamberlain family also had no other way of commercializing it, but this is a particularly grievous example. We have secrecy occur maybe with a bit less cost for other examples. Coca-Cola famously keeps its formula secret, or it did. It's not much of an issue anymore. Thomas Muffins has also a secret formula. It splits it three ways with three people in the world who can't ever travel together on a plane to keep it secret. But no one else knows it. Isaac Newton famously invented calculus, kept it to himself for 15 years before somebody else invented it, and then he whipped it out and said, "See, I invented it first." Again, a paranoid thing. Now, one suspects that secrecy isn't the greatest thing in the world to have happen. It is like the worst example of an ideas market failing. What about competition? Well, competition is what happens if you have more than one significant potential licensee for an idea. So in the case of Bob Kearns, for instance, he approached Ford and seemed to just do that. But some economists, Anton and Yao in 1994, said, well, in some situations, you could actually threaten credibly to give an idea to a rival. For instance, Kearns could have gone to Ford and said, look, if you don't pay me, I'm going to drive this down and I'm literally going to give it to GM. I mean, what do I have to lose? You're going to rip it off me anyway. Now, Ford has something to lose from that because Ford would like to use the intermittent windshield wiper as a key feature to push people to Ford cars and away from GM. And so the threat would be to damage the firm competitively, for which there needs to be competition, and it needs to be credible. So it can be credible because the idea seller expects, not to earn anything unless they can play off different rivals against one another. But you also have to be a pretty bold negotiator to do that. Maybe you need Donald Trump in these days to bring the art of the deal to you. Of course, if you can enter production yourself, you've got an inbuilt threat to some degree. Again, how tough could you be? That's what we have to think of here. The final thing, of course, is could you actually hold some knowledge back in order to sort of generate this idea and give some leverage? That's another thought, but it all really depends on the type of idea you're selling, which I'm not going to get into here.